The twin moons of Virelia bathed the crystalline city in an ethereal glow, their silver light cascading over the towering spires and intricate bridges woven from luminous threads of energy. The air shimmered with an almost tangible harmony, a delicate balance that every Virelian was expected to uphold. Yet, in the heart of the grand palace, behind a set of towering doors that had been sealed for as long as most could remember, sat a girl who had never truly belonged. Selene Carter, Princess of Virelia, had always been a whisper in the halls, a name spoken in hushed tones, laced with discomfort. She was a daughter of the royal bloodline, yet she was no more than a shadow, a carefully concealed flaw in the kingdom's unblemished tapestry. From birth, Selene had been different. While other Virelians glowed with soft, steady luminescence, a sign of their inner equilibrium, her light was wild, untamed. It flickered and surged unpredictably, responding to her emotions rather than her will. In moments of distress, sparks of uncontrolled energy danced along her skin, illuminating the air around her in erratic bursts. To her people, who revered control and harmony above all else, this was more than an inconvenience. It was a threat. She still remembered the first time her power had manifested. She had been no older than 5, a curious child desperate to be loved, to be seen. The Grand Council had gathered for a royal ceremony, an event where dignitaries from neighboring systems had come to witness the splendor of Virelia's perfectly synchronized energy flow. Selene, eager to please, had stepped forward to present a ceremonial crystal to her mother, Queen Isolde. The moment her small fingers curled around the delicate artifact, her heart had pounded with excitement, and the world had erupted in light. A burst of uncontrolled energy had surged from her, shattering the crystal into 1,000 radiant shards. Gasps of horror had filled the chamber. Elders had shielded their eyes, noblewomen had whispered behind elegant hands, and the queen. Her mother had only stared. Not in anger, not in concern, but in disappointment. From that day forward, Selene was no longer a princess in the eyes of Virelia. She was a mistake. The years that followed were a silent sentence. She was not banished, but she might as well have been. Her name was erased from formal records, her existence acknowledged only in the privacy of the palace walls. She was not allowed to attend diplomatic events, not included in ceremonies, and certainly never permitted to step into the sacred halls of the resonance chambers, where Virelians formed their lifelong bonds. Even within her own home, she was treated as an unspoken shame. The grand corridors of the palace became her prison. She dined alone, learned alone, and when the city gathered to celebrate its achievements, she watched from the shadows. Some nights, she would sit by the glass-paneled balcony overlooking the city of lights, wondering what it felt like to be part of it, to walk freely, to belong. But dreams had little use in a world that did not want her. There was only one place where she could breathe without feeling like an aberration, a forgotten workshop tucked away at the edge of the royal gardens. It had been abandoned for years, its once grand marble pillars now overgrown with vines of soft-glowing flora. No one ventured there. Perhaps that was why Selene claimed it as her own. It was in this place, far from prying eyes, that she discovered her one true solace: sculpting. She worked with Virelian crystal, a rare and delicate material that absorbed and reflected energy. With careful hands, she molded intricate designs, allowing her light to interact with the raw stone in ways that no one else could. Her sculptures were unlike anything in Virelia. They pulsed with shifting colors, radiating emotions that words could never capture. A pair of intertwined figures, reaching for each other across an unseen distance. A lone star encased in a storm of fragmented light. A phoenix rising from the ashes, wings outstretched against the void. Each piece was a fragment of her soul. Each piece was a story of longing, of defiance, of hope. But no one ever saw them, and no one ever would, because no one cared. For years, she had been allowed to exist in this fragile, hidden existence, neither accepted nor exiled. But soon, even that would end. Her 18th birthday loomed. On that day, every Virelian of age would stand before the council to seek a bondmate, a partner with whom they could merge their energy, creating a resonance that strengthened them both. Bonding was not just tradition, it was survival. Without a bondmate, a Virelian's energy would begin to weaken over time, draining them until nothing remained. It was why exile was considered a fate worse than death, a slow, inevitable unraveling of the soul. Selene knew what awaited her. No one would step forward for her. No one would even dare try. And so, the moment her name was called, she would be sentenced to a life beyond the stars, cast away from the only home she had ever known. Not because of a crime, not because of a choice she had made, but simply because she had been born wrong. The thought should have terrified her. But instead, as she sat in the dim glow of her workshop, running her fingers over the smooth curves of a newly finished sculpture, she realized something strange. She was not afraid. Because if this was a world that could only love perfection, a world that would sooner erase her than accept her, then perhaps she did not belong to it after all. Perhaps she was meant for something more. The grand halls of the Virelian palace pulsed with ambient light, a symphony of glowing silk drapes, crystalline chandeliers, and the soft luminescence of its guests. Every movement was fluid, every gesture precise, every face sculpted into expressions of serene control. The energy in the air was almost tangible, a perfect harmony that had taken centuries to refine. Jace Sullivan had seen many courts in his diplomatic career, but none like this. He had spent the last few years navigating delicate alliances between Earth and the highly advanced species of the known galaxy. And while Virelia had always intrigued him, its people fascinated him more. They were unlike humans, ethereal, graceful, untouched by the imperfections of his own kind. At least, that was what they wanted the universe to believe. He stood near one of the towering crystalline pillars, a drink in his hand, pretending to admire the intricate architecture while quietly observing the people around him. His role tonight was simple: maintain relations, listen, learn. Earth's place in intergalactic politics was still precarious, and he had no intention of making waves. And yet, despite all the beauty and refinement surrounding him, his attention kept drifting to one person. She stood apart from the rest, not because she wished to, but because she had no choice. The space around her was empty, an invisible barrier enforced not by walls but by silent rejection. Selene. The name had barely been spoken all evening, but Jace had heard it enough to understand that she was a complication. Where other Virelians glowed with a soft, steady light, hers flickered. It moved unpredictably, flashing in sharp, uneven bursts when she walked, as if her very existence defied the order of this world. The moment she stepped too close to someone, they shifted away, feigning indifference but making their intentions clear. Some abandoned their conversations altogether, moving deeper into the crowd to avoid the uncomfortable reminder that perfection in Virelia was not as absolute as it seemed. Jace had seen exclusion before. He had lived it. He knew what it felt like to be treated as if you were less, to be pushed aside without a single word spoken. There was a weight in her posture, a practiced indifference in the way she held her head high, as if she had long learned that dignity was her only shield. But her eyes, when they lifted, just for a second, revealed something else entirely. Pain. Not the kind that came from physical wounds, but the slow, quiet ache of being unseen, unheard, unwanted. Jace knew that feeling well. Their gazes met across the room, a fleeting moment of recognition that neither had expected. For a heartbeat, she didn't look away. Then, just as quickly, she did. She turned and strode toward the arched exit leading to the outer corridors, her gown catching the shifting light like fractured stardust. The space she left behind closed immediately, the noble guests resuming their laughter, their conversations, their carefully practiced harmony, as if she had never been there at all. Jace exhaled slowly, watching her disappear beyond the doorway. Every instinct told him to let it go, to remain where he was, to play his part as the neutral observer. But curiosity tugged at him. What kind of world built itself upon such rigid standards that even its own bloodline could be cast aside? More importantly, what kind of person endured it? Before he had fully thought it through, Jace found himself moving. He set his drink down on a passing tray, weaving his way through the guests with the ease of someone who had spent years blending into places he did not belong. He slipped through the archway, his boots nearly silent against the polished floors as he followed the fading trace of Selene's presence. The corridor outside the ballroom was quieter, dimly lit compared to the brilliance of the main hall. It stretched along the palace's outer edge, lined with tall windows that overlooked the city below. From here, he could see the spires of Virelia's capital rising like sculpted light, a breathtaking vision of seamless design. Selene stood near one of the windows, her back to him. She wasn't admiring the view. Her hands were curled into loose fists at her sides, her posture rigid, shoulders slightly hunched, as if she were bracing herself against something unseen. Jace hesitated for only a second before stepping forward. "You don't seem to enjoy parties much," he said, his voice measured, casual. She turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. "You shouldn't be here." Her voice was quiet, but there was no fragility in it. Only exhaustion. Jace leaned against the nearest pillar, his gaze unwavering. "Neither should you." A humorless smile flickered across her lips. "Yet, here we are." For a long moment, she said nothing else. She didn't ask who he was or why he had followed her. She simply stood there, watching the city below, as if waiting for him to lose interest. He didn't. After a while, she exhaled, turning fully to face him. The glow beneath her skin pulsed faintly, erratic but mesmerizing, like the dying embers of a distant star. "I know who you are," she said finally. "Jace Sullivan, Earth's diplomat." He inclined his head slightly. "And I know who you are, Selene Carter." A bitter chuckle escaped her. "I doubt you learned that from anyone in that room." He didn't deny it. Instead, he studied her, the way she stood, the way her fingers tightened subtly at her sides. "They treat you like a ghost," he observed. "Like you're not really here." Her jaw tensed. "Maybe I'm not." There was something in the way she said it, something final. Jace had spent his life reading people, and in that moment, he understood one thing with absolute certainty. She was already preparing to disappear. Not tonight. Not from this palace. But from Virelia itself. He didn't know why that realization unsettled him. He didn't know why he cared. What he did know was that he had followed her tonight for a reason. And whatever that reason was, he couldn't walk away just yet. The palace grounds stretched far beyond the opulent halls of the royal court, winding into hidden paths that led to places long forgotten. Beneath the pristine image of perfection that Virelia projected, there were corners untouched by the glow of its civilization, places where imperfection lingered in quiet defiance. Jace had followed instinct more than reason when he set out that night. There had been something in Selene's voice, in the way she had looked at him before walking away, that unsettled him. She was not merely resigned to her fate. She had already accepted it. He had spent a lifetime fighting against the world's expectations, proving himself in places that had never truly welcomed him. He recognized the loneliness in her, because it mirrored the one he had carried for years. He followed her trail past the palace's outer gardens, past the pathways lined with glowing flora that twisted and pulsed in perfect synchrony with the energy of the city. But the deeper he walked, the more the harmony of Virelia faded. The pathways grew uneven, the light dimmed, and soon, he reached a part of the palace he had never seen before. The structure was old, its stonework softened by time and neglect. It stood on the edge of the royal estate, half forgotten, nestled between walls of crystalline rock that refracted the moonlight in fractured patterns. Jace pushed open the heavy door, stepping into the quiet space beyond. At first, he thought it was abandoned. Then he saw the light. It wasn't like the sterile, controlled glow of the palace, nor the soft luminescence of the city beyond. This was something else entirely, alive, shifting, breathing. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over the room. The walls were lined with shelves, each holding intricate sculptures made of Virelian crystal, their surfaces carved with impossible precision. They glowed with an inner fire, pulsating in slow, rhythmic waves. One sculpture depicted two figures reaching for each other across an unseen divide, their hands never quite touching, suspended in frozen longing. Another showed a lone star, fractured yet still burning, surrounded by the void. Jace didn't need to be an artist to understand what he was looking at. These weren't just sculptures. They were emotions. A story told in light, in form, in every delicate curve. And then he felt it. A shift in the air behind him. He turned just as Selene stepped into the doorway, her eyes narrowing at the sight of him standing among her work. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice sharper than the edges of the crystal she carved, she said, "You shouldn't be here." Jace held up his hands slightly, a silent gesture of peace. "I could say the same about you." Selene didn't move further into the room, but she didn't retreat either. She stood stiffly at the entrance, watching him as if waiting for the inevitable, the ridicule, the dismissal, the judgment she had grown so used to. But Jace didn't laugh. He didn't sneer. He looked back at the sculptures, at the light that pulsed within them, and shook his head slightly. "This is—" He searched for the right word. "Incredible." Selene's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Disbelief. "You're mocking me," she said flatly. "No," Jace said. "I'm not." She crossed her arms, her shoulders tense. "No one comes here. No one looks at these. That's their mistake." Silence stretched between them, heavy with something unspoken. Selene had spent years convincing herself that she didn't care what people thought, that their opinions didn't matter. But standing here, watching Jace study her work with something that wasn't pity, but genuine admiration, made something shift in her chest. She hated it. She stepped further inside, keeping her distance, but watching him carefully. "You think a few kind words will make a difference?" Jace turned to face her fully. "I think truth makes a difference." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "Then tell me, what do you see?" Jace considered her for a moment, then let his gaze drift back to the sculptures. "I see someone who has been told all her life that she's broken," he said, his voice steady. "Someone who has been pushed aside, ignored, forgotten." He took a step closer to the shelf, studying the intricate carvings. And yet, instead of fading away, she found a way to be seen, to leave something behind, to create something no one else in this world could. Selene stood still, her pulse thrumming in her ears. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever looked at her like that. She should have pushed him away, should have told him to leave, should have let the walls she had built around herself remain unshaken. But she couldn't. Because for the first time in her life, someone saw her. Not as a princess. Not as a failure. Not as an exile waiting to happen. But as a person. Jace turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "I don't see a mistake," he said quietly. "I see an artist." Selene's breath caught. She had spent her entire life hearing whispers of what she was. An imperfection, a burden, an anomaly. She had told herself she didn't care. But deep down, some part of her had desperately wanted to be wrong. And now, standing in the dim glow of her hidden world, she felt something dangerous stir inside her. Hope. She shook her head slightly, forcing herself to look away. "It doesn't matter," she said, voice tight. "None of this does." Jace studied her for a long moment before responding. "Then why do you do it?" She had no answer. Or maybe she did. But she wasn't ready to say it. So instead, she turned away, reaching for one of the unfinished sculptures on her work table. "You should go." Jace hesitated, then nodded once. "I will." But as he moved toward the door, he paused. "This work deserves to be seen," he said over his shoulder. Then, with a final glance at her, at the glow of her skin, at the way the light of her creations reflected in her guarded eyes, he stepped out into the night. Selene exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself that his words were meaningless. But as she looked down at the sculpture in her hands, the one she had never finished, the one that had never quite felt right, she saw it differently now. For the first time, She wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was right. The grand square of Virelia pulsed with a rhythmic glow, a sea of luminescent figures standing in perfect formation. Towering crystalline spires surrounded the ceremonial grounds, their surfaces reflecting the soft radiance of the gathered crowd. The bonding trials were one of the most sacred rituals in Virelian society, an event that solidified lifelong partnerships, merging energy and spirit into a seamless resonance. For most, it was a moment of celebration, a promise of unity, strength, and belonging. For Selene, it was a slow walk toward exile. She stepped forward onto the polished stone, her gown catching the light like fractured stardust. The ceremonial fabric, though elegant, felt like a shroud, as if the very threads had been woven to mark the end of her existence here. The moment she entered the square, the air around her shifted. It was almost imperceptible at first, the way conversation softened, how laughter faded into murmurs. Then, the crowd's movements became more deliberate, subtle shifts in posture as people instinctively stepped away. The space around her widened, forming a quiet, unspoken barrier. No one approached. Selene's pulse hammered against her ribs, but her face remained impassive. She had expected this. The rules of the trial were simple. Each participant would extend their hand toward a chosen partner. If their energies were compatible, the bonding process would begin. A luminous connection forming between them, weaving their life forces together in perfect synchrony. It was a sacred process, a merging of souls that dictated the course of a Virelian's future. For Selene, there had never been a future. She stood in the center of the square waiting for someone, anyone, to step forward. The silence stretched. Then came the whispers. She can't control her power. If someone bonds with her, it could ruin their resonance forever. She's unstable, dangerous. The words didn't need to be spoken loudly. They slithered through the air like an unseen force, wrapping around her throat, tightening with every second that passed. Selene clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She would not break. Not here. Not in front of them. Her gaze swept across the sea of faces, meeting only avoidance. Even the elders who presided over the ceremony exchanged quiet glances, their expressions unreadable, but their message clear. No one would choose her. And when the final moment passed, when all the others had been bonded and she remained standing alone, the queen herself would issue the decree. Selene Carter was unfit for bonding, and as such, could not remain in Virelia. The decision had already been made long before today. The ritual was nothing more than a formality. Her heart pounded. Then, something changed. A shift in the air, so subtle at first that she barely noticed. A figure moved against the tide of the crowd, stepping into the open space beside her. Selene turned her head, her breath catching. He was hooded, his features obscured by the soft folds of his cloak, but she knew. Jace. What was he doing? He stepped toward her with an ease that sent another ripple through the onlookers. The murmurs grew louder, uncertain, questioning. This was no mistake. He was moving with purpose. He stopped just before her, meeting her eyes beneath the shadow of his hood. Selene's hands trembled, not from fear, but from sheer disbelief. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, though her voice barely carried over the hum of energy that now thickened the air between them. Jace's voice was steady. "I choose you." It was not a question, not a hesitant offer. It was a statement. A breath caught in Selene's throat. For the first time in her life, someone stood beside her, not out of obligation, not out of pity, but because they had chosen to. The crowd stirred, voices rising in a mixture of shock and protest. The elders exchanged looks of quiet alarm. This was not supposed to happen. Selene barely heard any of it. Her gaze was locked onto Jace's, searching for something, reason, hesitation, doubt. But there was none. Slowly, hesitantly, she raised her hand. Their fingers brushed. The world exploded. A brilliant wave of energy erupted, spiraling outward in a surge of pure, unrestrained light. The force of it sent a shockwave rippling through the square, knocking some of the spectators backward. Gasps filled the air as the ground beneath them shook, the very stone pulsing with the force of the connection forming between them. Selene's vision blurred at the edges as she felt the resonance. Real, overwhelming, undeniable. This wasn't like anything Virelia had ever seen before. This wasn't just a bond. It was something more. Her power, the force that had once marked her as a failure, was no longer spiraling out of control. It was balanced, centered, merging seamlessly with Jace's presence. The murmurs in the crowd turned to shouts. A human had bonded with a Virelian. It was impossible. And yet, as the golden arcs of light crackled between their hands, as Selene felt for the first time what it meant to be whole, she realized the truth. Nothing had ever been impossible. They had only been afraid to see it. The silence that followed the explosion of energy was deafening. The golden arcs of light that had momentarily consumed the square began to fade, leaving behind a charged atmosphere so thick it felt almost suffocating. Selene could still feel the warmth of Jace's hand against hers, the lingering hum of their connection thrumming beneath her skin. But the moment of awe was fleeting. A sharp gasp echoed through the crowd. Then another. Then the whispers began, like a rising tide of disbelief and anger. Selene turned, confusion swirling in her chest as she saw the expressions of the gathered elite, the nobles, the council members, the elders who had presided over this sacred ritual for centuries. Their faces were twisted in shock, in horror, in something deeper, something uglier. Jace stood motionless beside her, his hood still casting a shadow over his features. But Selene could feel the weight of their gazes drilling into him, as if they already knew that something was wrong. A voice, sharp and furious, cut through the noise. "Remove the hood!" It came from the raised platform where the council sat. Lord Marcellus, his robes shimmering with the deep gold of his status, stood with his hands clenched into fists, his entire body rigid with barely contained fury. Jace did not move. "Do it!" Marcellus commanded again, his voice like steel. Selene felt Jace's hesitation, a momentary pause before his fingers lifted to the edge of his hood. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed it back, revealing the truth. A ripple of gasps spread through the square, followed swiftly by chaos. He was human. Shouts erupted from the crowd, disbelief and outrage crashing over them like a tidal wave. Some took a step back, as if Jace's mere presence was a contamination. Others turned to the council in search of immediate action. Lord Marcellus took a step forward, his expression twisted in fury. "This is an insult," he roared. "A violation of our most sacred laws. A human cannot, must not, bond with a Virelian." The other council members murmured amongst themselves, their voices hushed but no less intense. Their entire belief system had just been shattered in the span of seconds. Queen Isolde stood motionless on the raised dais, her expression unreadable. But Selene knew her mother. She saw the flicker of something in her gaze. Uncertainty, conflict, doubt. Selene's heart pounded. She had spent her whole life being ignored, shunned, pushed into the shadows. Now, for the first time, they were all looking at her. She should have been afraid. But she wasn't. Jace's voice was calm but unyielding. "Why?" he asked, his gaze steady on Lord Marcellus. "Why is this a violation?" Marcellus's nostrils flared. "Because it is not our way. Humans are—" He stopped himself, jaw tightening, before continuing with barely restrained contempt. "Your kind is not compatible with ours." Jace exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "And yet, here we are." Selene felt something stir in her chest at the quiet defiance in his voice. "She is not the one who is broken," Jace said, his voice carrying across the square. "She is not the one who has spent her life in isolation, cast aside by a society too afraid to acknowledge her worth." His gaze swept the gathered elite. "You are." Gasps rippled through the crowd, but Jace didn't stop. "You speak of harmony," he continued, stepping forward, "of balance, and yet you reject what you do not understand. You claim to value perfection, but perfection means nothing if it comes at the cost of compassion." Selene swallowed hard. No one had ever spoken for her before. No one had ever stood beside her, not like this. She looked toward her mother, hoping, praying, for something. But Queen Isolda's face remained unreadable, her hands clenched at her sides as if she too was at war with herself. Marcellus was seething. This aberration will not stand. The bond must be severed. Selene's breath hitched. She knew what that meant. Forced separation. The severing of the bond was rare, used only in extreme cases. It was a violent process, one that could leave permanent scars on the mind, on the soul. And if they did it to her now, if they ripped Jace away from her, it would destroy both of them. No. The word left her lips before she even realized she had spoken it. Marcellus turned, his eyes narrowing. You do not have a say in this. Yes, I do. Her voice was steadier now, stronger. She took a step forward, her energy flaring around her. If you refuse to accept me, then I refuse to accept you. A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. For years she had been silent. For years she had let them decide her worth, but not anymore. I will not let you erase me, she continued, her voice clear, unwavering. I will not let you decide who I am, or what I deserve. I spent my entire life being told I was unworthy of connection, of love, of a place among my people. And now that I have finally found something real. She turned, meeting Jace's gaze. You want to take it away. The tension in the air was suffocating. Then, Queen Isolda finally spoke. Enough. The single word was soft, but it cut through the noise like a blade. All eyes turned to her. For the first time since the trial had begun, she stepped forward, descending from the dais with deliberate grace. She stopped before Selene, studying her daughter with something unreadable in her gaze. Selene held her breath. Then, the queen's attention shifted to the gathered nobles, her voice calm, but carrying an edge of finality. This is unprecedented, she said, and I will not make a decision lightly. Marcellus looked ready to protest, but Queen Isolda's gaze silenced him. I will hear what they have to say, she continued, and until then, no action will be taken. Selene exhaled, barely able to believe what she had just heard. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. For the first time, the future was uncertain, and for the first time, she had a chance to fight for it. The chamber was silent. The weight of the moment pressed upon every individual present, a collective inhale before the world exhaled into something new. The words had been spoken. Queen Isolda had shattered the stillness with a decree that would echo across generations. Change was coming. Selene stood motionless, her pulse thrumming in her ears. She had prepared herself for exile, for rejection, for battle if necessary. But she had not prepared for this, for her mother, the Queen of Virelia, to stand at the precipice of reform. It was almost impossible to believe. But it was real. Jace was still beside her, steady as ever, though she could feel the tension beneath his calm exterior. He had been through too much to trust easy victories. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, that change was never immediate, never clean. The murmurs from the nobles turned into a rising tide of voices, some in shock, others in anger. Even among those who had always followed Queen Isolda's rule without question, there were those who could not accept what had just been declared. Centuries of tradition had dictated their way of life, and to them, Selene's presence had always been an anomaly to be ignored, not embraced. Lord Marcellus stepped forward, his golden robes shimmering under the light of the grand chamber. His expression was impassive, but the storm in his eyes betrayed him. He was not a man accustomed to losing. This is reckless, he said, his voice low and controlled, yet brimming with barely restrained fury. You jeopardize the very foundation of our people. We have maintained order for generations, ensured balance, ensured our survival. And now, because of a single human and a girl who cannot control her own energy, you would throw it all away? Queen Isolda did not so much as flinch. She stood tall, regal, her gaze unwavering. I do not throw away our foundation, she said. I strengthen it. Marcellus let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. By bending to weakness? By embracing strength in all its forms, the Queen corrected. For too long, we have equated uniformity with power. But what I have seen today, what we have all seen, is that power does not belong solely to those who fit our expectations. It belongs to those who endure, to those who challenge us, to those who survive despite every obstacle placed before them. Her eyes flickered to Selene then, and for the first time in years there was something there that Selene had long given up on finding. Recognition. Selene swallowed hard, her throat tight. She had spent her whole life wanting to be acknowledged, but now that it was happening, she wasn't sure she could trust it. Not yet. The chamber erupted into debate. Some voices rose in agreement, speaking of fairness, of the need for progress. Others shouted in protest, claiming that if Virelia strayed from its ways, it would collapse into chaos and disorder. Jace shifted slightly, his stance subtly protective as he glanced at Selene. She could feel the unspoken question in his gaze. Was she ready for this fight? She wasn't sure, but she had come too far to step back now. Then a voice rang out, sharp and commanding enough to slice through the growing discord. "You all fear change," said a young noblewoman near the edge of the chamber. Her name was Astrid, a minor figure in court politics, but she had always been known for her quiet defiance of tradition. "But what you fear even more is the idea that you were wrong." A murmur spread through the room as she continued. "We were taught that only perfect harmony makes us strong. But what I saw today was something far more powerful than harmony. I saw resilience. I saw a connection so strong it defied the very laws we swore were unbreakable. And I, for one, will not ignore that truth simply because it is inconvenient." One by one, others began to speak, some hesitantly, some boldly. They were voices that had been silenced before, people who had never dared challenge the rigid ideals of their world. Until now. It started with a few. Then it became many. A movement was forming. They called it New Light. A coalition of those who had seen what had happened in the square and realized that their society was not as flawless as they had been taught to believe. They were the children who had grown up watching others be cast aside. The families who had lost loved ones to exile. The few who had always questioned the doctrine of perfection, but had never had a reason to stand against it. Now, they had a reason. Now, they had a voice. And they were going to use it. Marcellus stood stiffly as he took in the room, his sharp mind calculating, measuring the tides of power that had just shifted before his very eyes. His lips pressed into a thin line. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, for now. With deliberate slowness, he inclined his head. "This is not over," he warned, his voice calm but edged with an unmistakable promise. "Not everyone will accept this. Do not mistake temporary victory for lasting change." Then, with a final glance at Queen Isolde, he turned and strode out of the chamber. Selene let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Jace was watching her again, quiet, unreadable. "What?" she asked, exhaustion laced in her voice. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "You changed the world today." She shook her head. "I didn't do it alone." For the first time in as long as she could remember, she was not alone at all. The winds of change had swept through Virelia, carrying with them the echoes of a world that would never be the same. What had begun as a single act of defiance, a moment of unexpected connection, had ignited something far greater than either Selene or Jace could have imagined. The city no longer pulsed with the same quiet rigidity it once had. The whispers that once followed Selene like a ghost had shifted, turning from scorn to something softer, something laced with curiosity. The people of Virelia were watching, some with hope, some with fear, and others still clinging to the world they had always known. But change had already begun, and it could not be undone. Selene stood at the highest balcony of the royal palace, overlooking the vast city that stretched beneath her. The sky was painted in hues of violet and gold as the twin moons rose, casting their light over the streets below. For the first time, she wasn't just looking in from the outside. She was part of it. Beside her, Jace leaned against the railing, his gaze steady as he took in the sight before them. There was something unshakable about him, a quiet strength that had not wavered despite the battles they had fought, both against others and within themselves. Selene exhaled slowly. It still feels strange. Jace turned his head slightly. What does? She gestured toward the city. This. Standing here, knowing that for the first time, I belong. A small smile tugged at his lips. You always belonged. They were just too blind to see it. She tilted her head, studying him. And you? She asked. What made you see? Jace didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked back at the city, his expression thoughtful. Because I know what it's like, he finally said. To fight for a place in a world that was never built for you. To prove that you're worth more than what others decide for you. His voice was quieter now. To refuse to disappear. Selene's fingers curled against the railing. He understood. He always had. It had been weeks since the council meeting, since the tides had shifted in their favor, since Queen Isolde had declared that their society would no longer be bound by the rigid constraints of the past. And yet, the work was far from over. Not everyone had accepted this new reality. There were still those who looked at Selene with suspicion, who whispered of tradition and purity, who believed that what had happened that day in the square was an aberration, not a sign of progress. But there were also those who had stepped forward, those who had seen the cracks in the foundation of their world and wanted something different. It was for them that the Luminary Initiative had been born. A movement to ensure that no one else would be cast aside. A place for those who had been silenced, those who had been deemed unworthy, those who had been told that they would never belong. It was more than an idea now. It was real. And today, it would be recognized. Selene and Jace made their way through the palace corridors, stepping into the vast ceremonial square where the people of Virelia had gathered once more. Not in secrecy, not in hushed murmurs of fear or dissent, but in something new. Something almost reverent. At the center of the square stood a monument, gleaming beneath the moonlight. A statue, carved from the very same bioluminescent crystal that Selene had spent years working with in the solitude of her hidden workshop. It was a simple design, yet profound in what it represented. Two figures, one reaching toward the other, their hands barely touching, the space between them glowing with a soft, unwavering light. A reminder of the moment everything had changed. A reminder that true connection could not be dictated by laws or tradition. That it was something deeper, something untamed and infinite. At its base, words had been etched into the stone. Perfection is not control, but acceptance. Selene stared at it for a long moment, her chest tightening. She had spent her entire life believing that she was flawed, that her existence was something to be tolerated at best, erased at worst. And yet, here she stood, not as a shadow, not as a mistake, but as a force of change, as someone who had been seen. Jace stood beside her, watching her quietly. Selene turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you regret it? He frowned slightly. Regret what? Choosing me, she said. Standing beside me when you could have walked away, when it would have been easier. Jace's expression softened. No, he said, his voice steady. I never have, and I never will. A breath shuddered from her lips. He reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers, the warmth of his touch grounding her. She didn't know what the future would bring. There would still be battles to fight, still be voices raised in protest, still be those who refused to let go of the past. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid, because she would not face it alone. Jace squeezed her hand. We've come this far, he said, glancing toward the city. Let's see how much further we can go. Selene smiled, her fingers tightening around his. A new chapter had begun. And together, they would write the rest of the story. Across the galaxies, across time itself. You've found your way here. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Let's see how far across the universe our community reaches. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because tomorrow's episode will take you even deeper into the unknown. You won't want to miss it.